good insight. I have no sense of who's next here, so we'll just go here and then.
And on just a little bit of a different subject, in your professional opinion, what do you think the future for Mel Gibson is? Is there any hope that Mel Gibson or somebody like Mel Gibson can actually be saved, corrected, moved to the...
Incarcerated.
Mel Gibson, not likely, but I'll say why. The abusers who do change after periods of experiencing a series of consequences that they find really unpleasant. And not just one, but a whole series of consequences that they find really unpleasant for what they've done. Combined with being forcefully called on what they have done by people that they care about. And that is rarely part of an abuser's experience. He rarely experiences any significant degree of consequences that he finds at all unpleasant, certainly not a series of them. And his own friends and relatives almost always back him up.
Including his ex-wife.
How do you mean including his ex-wife?
Mel Gibson's ex-wife.
Oh, in his case.
Previous.
Before, I see what you meant before. So I have not had a lot of clients make really significant changes. Now, I'm not the world's most stellar abuse counselor, but I was pretty good at it, so I don't think it was lack of technique. There are people who are definitely better at it than I am, but I was pretty good at it. But you know, you don't see huge rates of change in any really chronic, destructive behavior pattern. An abuser program, we expect in the state of Massachusetts, abusers to go once a week for 40 weeks. A substance abuser, which is no more serious a problem, in some ways I would say it's easier to overcome a substance abuse problem than a woman abuse problem. A substance abuser is expected to go to on the order of 150 to 200 meetings just to be considered to have made a good start towards sobriety. You do 3, 4, 5 meetings a week for a year, you are considered to have made some significant beginning. You're not considered to have done your work. You're considered to be significantly out of the starting block. And yet after 40 meetings for someone who's been physically violent to women, and this whole pattern of degradation we've been talking about, we somehow think that in 40 meetings he's done his work. So there are so many obstacles right now to getting abusers to change. There's this whole societal unwillingness to impose significant consequences, like the legal system still gives a total slap on the hand if it gives anything at all. There's a complete unwillingness to keep abusers away from children so they don't experience that consequence. In other words, if post-separation they get the same access that a non-battering dad would get. Often they get better access than a non-battering dad would get because they're better at that kind of adversarial legal battle kind of atmosphere. The one consequence that they are experiencing to some extent that's significant to them is the loss of relationships, but it's very hard to get them away from an abuser, so they haven't usually lost like 4 relationships or something because they're abused, because they're so hard to get away from.
Oh, they just move on to the next one.
What's that?
They tend to move on to the next one.
Right, they can get somebody else.
But that
Sometimes they do
stop.
start to get sick of losing relationships. That can be one significant, if it's been named for them that those were because of abuse, that can start to become one significant consequence. But like I say, the consequences have to come in a series along with a lot of confrontation. And it's certainly not going to happen to someone like Mel Gibson because there are going to be so many people prepared to back him up. And he's so arrogant already, and the arrogance of abusers just fits with the arrogance of the celebrity. And he thinks he's so good looking, and I guess once he was. Don't go out with him. I don't have a lot of hope. I'd say no.
In regard to the using children and also this more prevalence of getting women arrested, can you speak to the fathers groups having an impact on these situations?
It's very interesting that we're at the Department of Revenue because that's really where the so-called fathers' rights movement was born. Not in here, sorry. I don't mean to say but it was a response to the society getting much more serious about enforcing child support. It was a completely unexpected consequence. We didn't know, obviously, this was going to happen. But as in the late 70s and early 80s, as the whole atmosphere toward child support enforcement completely changed, and suddenly you actually had to pay your child support, the abusers bonded together and formed these father supremacy organizations. And first of all, they're not fathers' rights organizations. That's what they're called. That's what they call themselves. But why should we let them decide what to call themselves? Fathers' rights are a good thing, as are mothers' rights and children's rights. Those are all positive things. These organizations are not devoted to fathers' rights. I've spent so much time, gag me with a spoon, reading their literature for over a decade. I go back to when they had paper newsletters, and it's like, remember the Stone Age? Well, I remember when the father supremacists had paper newsletters. That goes back really far. Back before we had to take them seriously. Although in some ways I wish we had taken them seriously at the time. So I know what's in their literature. What's in their literature is anti-mother, anti-female stuff. It's a deluge of it. And it's saying that women are out to use false allegations of domestic violence and false allegations of sexual abuse to cut caring fathers off from their children. And it's constant complaints about child support. We are here to show how much we deeply care about our children and to get our child support reduced. And I've also had the experience of arguing with these guys because they tend to get up in my face at conferences, and they say that they're about equality between mothers and fathers. You just lure them into an argument, and within 5 minutes, no, usually within about 2 minutes, they're arguing about why fathers are more important to children than mothers are, and why fathers are a positive influence while mothers are a destructive influence. These guys who aren't abusers don't like these groups. I had an experience. I used to do a bunch of training for state troopers in Massachusetts. And I started explaining once, I don't even remember why, but because it's not the kind of thing I usually get into with troopers, but for some reason I got to explaining about what the so-called fathers' rights organizations are about. And this trooper came up to me during a break. He seemed like he was maybe mid-30s. And he said, you know, my wife really jerks me around visitation, like she's mad at me about something else, then I don't get to see the kids, and she's just playing all these games with me about visitation, using the kids as a weapon against me. So I went to one of these fathers' rights meetings, because I thought that's where you were supposed to go if you were getting jerked around your visitation. They were all battlers in there. He said, at one point, they asked for a show of hands of whoever had a restraining order against them, and I was the only guy in the room that didn't raise. So I thought, well, you know, that's from the mouth of the state trooper. That's very helpful. There's lots more I can say about them, and there's some interesting things that have been written about them. What the key point to understand now is that they've developed mainstream influence. They're considered the voice of fathers, even though, again, they get no support from fathers except abusive fathers. And their stands are very extreme. They keep claiming in public that they're moderate, but again, you go look at what they're actually standing for, and their stands are extreme. And so calling them fathers' rights organizations, to me, is like calling the KKK an equal rights for white people organization. There was a judge that was shot in Nevada about a year ago through the courthouse window by a father that was angry about what that judge was doing on his custody case. And you should have seen what these fathers' organizations were writing on their websites about this. They weren't rapidly distancing themselves from this act. They were saying things like, well, this helps us see what fathers are being driven to by how the court is treating them, and so that's how they show their true colors about what supporters of violence they are.
Hey, can you tell us what you would call them? You talked about what you would.
Yeah, I refer to them as father supremacy organizations because that when you really pursue their arguments with them, that's actually what they're promoting. So that's, to me, that's not name calling. That's an accurate description of what they're actually arguing for. Especially because they're saying that domestic violence and child abuse perpetration should not in any way affect your access to children. They complain all this time about false allegations, but you should also see their reactions to allegations even after they're admitted to be true. Because there aren't that many false allegations. Obviously, there's going to be some, but there's not tons of them. But they make it sound like there's just tons and tons and tons of false allegations. But you see their reactions to allegations that are true. And they're still arguing, well, that's not a reason why father shouldn't have any contact with his child. I sat in court on the Cape, and on a case where everyone who had examined the case had concluded that the sexual abuse was true. A sexual abuse evaluator, the guardian ad litem himself, had concluded that the judge had concluded that the sexual abuse was true. I had read the judge's ruling from earlier. That the judge was being really nasty to the mom. I was sitting in court, and the mom's lawyer says there was a finding of sexual abuse on this case. And the judge says to the mom, wasn't that like 4 years ago?
Oh my God.
He was up for Chief Justice. Too. He didn't get Chief Justice. I forget, I'm blanking. But you wanted to do a follow-up?
Well, it seems like there are actual tutorials out there on how to navigate the probate system. And, you know, in terms of getting a rest, in terms of parental alienation syndrome,
Right.
and, you know, there's just step-by-step out there of what to do.
There it is. All right, this is going to have to be the last one. Yes.
Bystander question. You had talked a little bit earlier about how often survivors, you have clear that the survivors being abused, it becomes clear in the workplace that that's what's going on, that she's fired or she's pushed out because of the abuser's behavior. And what I'm wondering is, what do you say to employers to deal with the fear part, to deal with, like, we don't want him coming here, you know, that it's clear that she's in danger, and the issue is just that they don't want the batterer showing up and hurting somebody else in the workplace. How do you talk to employers about that?
Well, there are a couple things. One is to point them towards the websites like the Employers Against Domestic Violence, and let me see if I remember the name of there was another one that I really wanted to mention. It's like, shoot, what is that? Oh, Safe at Work. And because part of what I want to do with employers is to just help them feel like this has just become a sort of normal, standard practice, like best practice. Like, we're not proposing something unusual. We're actually proposing what's starting to be commonly accepted practice. And so we want to get them to sort of have that feeling. We're just talking about commonly accepted practice. And they'll get specific guidelines about how you create appropriate security at work, how you keep your employees safe, for step-by-step thinking about how you secure your workplace. If you're a big enough place to have a security force, how you train your security force specific to responding to domestic violence cases. How do you deal with a protective order? How do you deal with cases where both people are employees? Because some workforces end up in that situation where the abuser works for them. And so there's a whole lot of step-by-step resource available to them at Employers Against Domestic Violence and at Safe at Work, so that they don't have to act helpless, because it'll lay right out for them the kinds of steps that they should take.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that another way to talk to them about that is about the recent Cascade case in which employers have been ruled against now several times for essentially using the rationale that they had to keep the other workers safe, so they had to take some type of action, either harming, making the woman leave or making her move. So there's legal precedents now that employers are being held accountable and getting penalties for failing to respond appropriately. And Employers Against Domestic Violence, we have references to that case law on our website.
Cascade, it's called?
Yeah, Cascade.
You know what state it was out of?
I believe it was California.
Okay, so you can find that on the Cascade case on Employers Against Domestic Violence. So I've got to let people go because it's 2 o'clock. If anybody wants to stay and talk for a few minutes, they can, but I don't want people to feel captive. This has been a really good discussion. It's a pleasure to talk to an audience that doesn't have to be won over. You guys are bored. I realize I've been preaching to the choir here, but I like preaching.
Great, what's going on, right?